It's the Worth Knowing live stream. I'm Matt Robison, and today we are going to tackle a question that's been on my mind a lot in the last 18 months, and I strongly suspect on yours as well. When and how should we resist when the government, when power turns evil? This is a challenge that's confronted all of us as we read and hear every day about the things that the current power, the current government is doing. And I probably don't need to remind you of what I'm talking about and of the damage that's been done. But if you need a reminder, just go back to my interview from a month ago with Ann Kim and Ira Shapiro about the book they edited from the Common Sense Coalition, a bipartisan group of experts, 45 of them at the top levels of government, called Betrayed. America didn't vote for this. Just as a tiny sample, I imagine over the past 18 months, if you're like me, you've asked yourself, when does it become time to resist? And how do I do it? When a masked paramilitary terrorizes American communities and murders dozens of people, including 3 American citizens, with 2 more killings in just the past week. How and when do I resist when the government does away with USAID and kills at least 500,000 people and is on track to kill at least 9 million more by 2030, some of the poorest and most unfortunate people on earth? When do you act? And what do you do? How and when do we resist when the government in power persecutes political enemies, tries to drive media figures who question them out of business or put them in prison, and uses its power to attack universities and law firms and science and shut down access to vaccines? What do we do about a government that goes to war illegally or simply executes hundreds of people on boats? How to resist a government so steeped in corruption that it's virtually impossible to come up with a dollar estimate of how much graft they've taken, including the amount of bribery that's gone into gaining pardons for corrupt politicians and drug traffickers and scam artists. Although these numbers give you a sense of the scale, Reuters found that of the more than 1,700 people Trump had granted clemency to, 96% failed to meet DOJ clemency guidelines. And the pardons he's issued have erased an estimated $1.3 billion owed to victims in restitution. For me, one of the ways I've tried to dissent is to write about all of these things, which I've done in Newsweek and on my Substack, and I talk about them all here on this show. But there's something about that gnaws at me constantly, and I wonder if you felt it too. Does anything I'm doing actually matter? An old friend of mine who has a talent for saying things that end up sounding like aphorisms once told me, when I was in the midst of a moral dilemma, that in life, we have to separate between that which makes us feel better and that which accomplishes something. And that gets at the core dilemma of dissent, because for each of these outrages from the current government and the current president, and countless more besides the ones I listed, I've posed 2 questions: when and how. For me, and I suspect for many of you, the question of when to dissent was easy to answer immediately. I've been writing and talking about these topics for years now. But the more important question is how. Because the hard truth that I have to face is that I risk very little in doing this, at least for now. The Department of Justice did just serve subpoenas on New York Times reporters for writing about the defensive weaknesses of the new Qatari bribe Air Force One plane. It's pretty clear that the First Amendment is no shield. So does low-risk dissent matter? How do you dissent when there is something at risk? And what pushes you over the tipping point to say that you need to take that risk? How do you decide what actually makes a difference versus what's just making you feel better? And is that even the right question to ask? Those are the kinds of questions that our guest today explored in his new book, How to Be a Dissident. Gal Beckerman writes for The Atlantic and previously wrote for 6 years at the New York Times Book Review. He's also written The Quiet Before on the unexpected origins of radical ideas, and When They Come for Us, Will Be Gone, about the epic struggle to save Soviet Jewry, an issue that's near and dear to me and my family. Gal, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you, and you are posing a series of really tough questions in your new book that I am very proud to have you on to talk about. They're incredibly important. I can't imagine a more important set of questions right now. And look, ultimately, as we get into the discussion, I want to have you help me navigate my own moral dilemmas, which I suspect are shared by many people in the audience. And I'd like to invite people to weigh in, as they already are in the chat, with the things that they do as a form of dissent and what they think matters. But I want to start with this. Let me quote from your book. In the past year, we've seen rich universities and influential law firms bow down before unconstitutional excesses of executive power. People have been deported for their political views. Agencies serving the poor have been defunded, accused of not being in ideological lockstep with the government. Book bans have been instituted. Statisticians have been fired for not producing positive enough economic figures. Senators have complained that they're scared to speak out, bending, thinking twice, remaining silent. I really never thought that these were American reflexes. Of course, people in other countries, China, Russia, Iran, watch these developments with a sense of recognition. Authoritarianism is currently on the rise globally. 72% of the Earth's population now live under such rule. So the top question is, do we need dissidents now more than ever?
Yes. It really was the thing that propelled me towards writing this book, towards exploring this topic. It was this question of, do we actually have it in us? For all of our sort of vaunted self-conception as Americans of being fiercely independent, nobody's going to tell me what to do. That moment, the moment that you described, that you read from just now, but also you described in your intro, was an extremely bracing one for me. To see people bend in the face of power, and not just people, but elites in this country, be faced with a question, find themselves on a moral crossroads. Do I do what I'm being asked to do by the government, or do I let my conscience guide me in this moment, my principles guide me in this moment, and to see how many people who had the power to say no couldn't and didn't. And it led me to think we don't actually have role models here, or role models that are within living memory. I guess you can look back to the McCarthy hearings and the people who resisted naming names, or you can look to the civil rights movement in the 1960s and the people who took real risks to their life and well-being to, insist on the equality of their fellow citizens. But those are enough in the distance, at least for me. I grew up at a time where there was a lot of sort of triumphalism about the freedoms that we have in this country. I was around 13 when the Berlin Wall fell, and into the 90s, there was a sense of, that's it. This American exceptionalism that I imbibed throughout my growing up is a fact. And then to be reeled back into this position of, oh, wait, I could face that kind of moral crossroads. I could be at a moment where I need to resign from a job, where I'm being asked to do something I don't want to do, or be forced to send my child to a war that I don't believe in, or see something happen to my neighbors, as happened to the folks in Minneapolis, that I feel is just morally wrong, that doesn't sit right with me. And I'm going to have to do something, or at least be faced with the position of embracing my moral agency to do something. And do I even know how to do that? So
Right, this grew out of a literal nightmare for you, didn't it?
It did.
You're putting yourself to the question here.
Right. I should say that I'm somebody who's read and steeped in sort of 20th century totalitarian history. So maybe this nightmare was specific to me, but it was the idea of being interrogated for something that I had done. And the something was not clear, but it was something like going to a protest or reading a book I wasn't supposed to read, something that was crossed some line that I didn't even know was there. And I was being asked to make a choice. Was I going to confess or give up my collaborators, or face dire consequences to myself, to my family? And I woke up before I could answer the question in the dream. But it made me realize that there actually is this incredible store of stories and lessons to be gained from people who have lived through situations that are, I don't think that we are in authoritarian or even totalitarian situation yet, but there are other people who have lived through that and had needed to draw on real internal reserves to face those moments, face them in ways that I've always found to be brave and admirable. And so I started kind of trying to see if there was almost like a personality profile that I could try to build. So we're talking about not the nitty gritty of what do you do, but how do you be? How do you orient yourself towards the world, towards your own society, so that you can do the brave things?
It's such a deep question, and I tried to separate it into the when and the how. When do you make that stand? And then how do you do it? Because I focus so much on impact. I focus on the practical side. I do that a lot on my Substack. I talk about what really matters in campaigns, the fight for the midterms. You're reaching a little deeper here
Yeah.
into the when. When do you make that stand? I only confront this kind of a question. I have your nightmare about once a year on at the Kol Nidre service before Yom
Mm,
Kippur, where you're forced to confront, if you're Jewish, and if you're not, then you're not, but you probably have this in other ways. You're forced
yeah.
to confront the historical legacy of, in our holiest day of the year, we had to literally incorporate a prayer that essentially releases us from the obligation to fulfill our vows before God, because we may be forced for our own survival to lie, to
Yeah.
break our vows,
Yeah.
and because we're taught that God prefers for us to live and to break those kinds of vows. But it's such a deep moral conundrum, because all of the people, all the dissidents that you profile in the course of this book, at some point reached that tipping point
Yep.
moment
Yeah.
and said, I won't do that. I might give up my life.
Yeah.
It's a really profound thing. And it
Yeah.
just, I was prepared in encountering this book to have it be an action guide for activists. It's not that. It's much
Yeah.
more about that first
Right.
step of asking yourself, what are you prepared to do?
Yeah, no, and I think it's interesting because one criticism I've heard from activists is, well, shouldn't we be focused more on how we build networks and how we kind of create a constituency and how we really do what needs to be done to gain power? And I think those are really important things. But the problem that I see in the last, let's say, the year and a half of living in our country and seeing this kind of having this kind of boiling frog moment, of
Yeah,
every
yeah.
day there's something else that feels unprecedented and feels, is that it occurred to me that we have to locate the problem not at how do we build to bigger movements, but how do we take the first step? And maybe it's not Matt or me, although I think it is more me, because I started this book as somebody who was like felt cowardly about those things, who stayed away from protests, or even though I felt all the things. And so I think that people don't acknowledge their own moral agency, often
Mm.
enough. And that was something that was really the big lesson for me of doing this book, is going through this exercise, because these individuals take very seriously that the job of being a human being is, or the responsibility and the, let's say, even the creative pleasure of being a human being, is being able to make these hard choices, is being able to stand for the thing that you actually believe in, that you feel in your conscience. There's a great Hannah Arendt, the German philosopher, I quote her at the very beginning of the book. She was trying to understand, she'd survived, she'd left Germany in time as German Jew, and was like forever haunted by, why did the world turn upside down on her, the world that she knew? And she asked particularly about the people who resisted and why they resisted, because there were Germans who didn't go along with the Nazis, few of them, but there were. And she wanted to understand what made them tick. In a way, these are my dissidents. These are the people that I'm interested in. And it wasn't what you would think. She said it's not that these people were like religious people with moral precepts that said, thou shalt not kill. She said those people actually were very easy to flip, because they just needed rules. So they were people who, thou shalt not kill became thou shalt kill. It was skeptics, the doubters, the people who ask themselves constantly, can I live with myself? That was the question. The people who go around saying, can I live with myself? And in this instance, they asked themselves that question. They said, living with myself would mean living with a murderer. I can't do that. And they took seriously the implications of that question, which is an extremely hard thing to do. I think that some of these people in this book are like North Stars for me, in the sense that they are so committed. I know that I can't be like them, but I like that they're asking that question. And I want to be asking that question more in my own life.
But it also, I thought I detected in the book sort of a really hard threshold. I agree with you, right? To be able to stand up and say, I can't go along with this because I can't live with myself. I would be condoning murder and I'm willing to take on this risk. That's a mountainous Pikes Peak level threshold.
Yeah.
But even before that, there's a really daunting psychological threshold that
Yeah.
you identify. And so let's just take a moment to talk about unethical human psychology experiments. I love them. I studied them in grad school. There's a lot to learn from them.
Yeah.
I think there's a real connection point to your larger, like the larger crisis that we're all facing about, well, what do we do in the age of Trump, right? So you talk about, I presume, I'm not sure you name it, but I presume you're talking about the Milgram.
I had to cover those experiments very quickly, and with the awareness that most people roughly familiar with them.
Right.
Yeah.
But the upshot is that you can show that people will go along with authority, even to the point of behaving sadistically toward their fellow human beings and administer what they think are potentially lethal electric shocks simply because someone in a white lab coat tells them to. You also go through the Stanford Prison experiment. Basically the same thing. You have some authority, you have some sanction to behave however you want against an other group, and lo and behold, you become sadistic and cruel. And then I want to just quote one piece from you from the Ash experiments, the Solomon Ash experiments on conformity. You show that a group of people are shown a page and a line and 3 other lines, and they ask which of the 3 match the original line, and the answer is, as you put it, blindingly obvious, like it's a well duh kind of thing, except when they trick the participants and they have other participants who are actually actors who give clearly the wrong answer, about a third of test subjects go along. And what you write is, this experiment has been replicated many times over the decades, always produces the same result. 33 to 38% of people are willing to abandon their sense of reality in order to align with others. And so I just want to ask you, have you noted Donald Trump's approval rating recently? And do you see a connection there, Gal?
That is funny. As I kind of knew you were. That's what I knew you were going to. When you emphasize the percentage, that is also when people talk about his core, the kind of shoot a person on Fifth Avenue base that they will not leave him no matter what. It is somewhere
Stanley Milgram, baby.
30% range. Yeah, maybe there's a correlation there, but I don't. But I think that you could apply it to lots of other environments where that's the case. And the one thing I want to say about, because actually conformity was something that I had to really think about, because it is the background against which dissidence happens, right? It's the contrast. It's what makes dissidence so hard. And in some ways, I don't blame us human beings for being like that, for being lemmings, because there's very good sort of evolutionary biology arguments that our survival as a species is because of our ability we're social animals. That is our strength. We don't have muscles, we don't have speed, we have an ability to work together towards goals, and that's, our brains got bigger as a result, and that sort of became our advantage. So it is hardwired in us to go along, to get along. That is something that we just really, that's how societies function. If everybody was a dissident, we'd have a pretty anarchic situation. And yet, I think you want to have people who are pushing the envelope, who are saying, wait a second, asking this sort of fundamental, like, why are we doing what we're doing? This thing that we take for granted, that we think is natural, that we think it is the way it has to be, let's push on that. Right? It's why I have a chapter in this book that's about Spinoza in the 17th century, questioning God and whether God exists, like asking these very fundamental questions. That kind of level of critical thinking is actually and then leading you into confrontation with conformity and with a sort of a universally accepted truth that maybe isn't an actually truth out in the world. That's where it starts to get difficult for a person. But I think the first chapter in this book, the other sort of interesting criticism, people say, oh, why? The first chapter of the book is called Be Alone. So you don't want to be alone. You want to be in community, in groups, and in movements. And yes, but most of the dissidents that I read dozens of dissident memoirs and talked to dissidents in other countries, and they all describe this moment where they realized that their commitment to the thing they believed in, that the sensitivity to the injustice that they were experiencing around them was going to put them in opposition, at least in the first, until they found their people, was going to put them in opposition to their families, to their communities, to their countries. And that was a moment of sort of existential crisis for them, where they had to contend with what the kind of vertigo of, oh, I've always felt like embedded within these social structures, and now I'm not. Who am I? And they're like, And am I crazy if I'm the only person who thinks like this? So it's important to recognize that, because I think we often look out and we say, why aren't more people joining? Why aren't more people in red America, like MAGA people, just like leaving the fold when they recognize even the thing when you ask them privately, they might admit that they feel about the direction of the country or the price of groceries or whatever, or Iran or whatever it is that could be triggering their doubts. They're not going to want to split with the community that they feel is part of their identity and who they are. It's very hard.
It's very hard. And it's, you organize the book, speaking of being alone, in that first chapter, you organize the book around these traits that dissidents share. Maybe it's a bit of a guide to thinking about, well, what does it take to have this kind of act of bravery? What's sort of what goes into the formula, whether even before you get to the question of impact,
Right.
what does it take to make that choice, the when rather than the how? I'm going to do this the ringer style, this question. Which of those 10 traits that you profile in those 10 chapters, what's the most overvalued and what's the most undervalued?
What's the most overvalued? What's the most overvalued? It's funny because I chose them in a kind of a counterintuitive way, in the sense when you see them be alone, or the second chapter is be pessimistic, they cause you to pause for a minute and wonder. But I'm thinking, as I'm saying this, I'm thinking they're all important. I mean,
okay, well then maybe you go off menu like a
right,
high-end restaurant patron, and you say, is there something that in the popular mind is important about dissenting and resisting that in your study here doesn't turn out among these 10 traits?
Yeah. So I would say be loud is the thing that and this is, in some ways, this is what my last book was about. So my last book was called The Quiet Before, and it's about how social movements build, and came out of a fear and that that social media was distorting the way that radical movements are forming, that they are having these very quick booms and busts because they are following the logic of our dominant communications medium and trying to do the thing that is the most bombastic, the loudest, the most performative, I know is like a word that gets thrown around a lot. Signaling, if you think about it in the realm of protest, it's, the most important thing is that we get 1 million people to Washington, D.C. on one day. Or the most important thing is that we get a hashtag that goes viral and that everybody's sharing, or a slogan like a Black Lives Matter that becomes like really flows through the bloodstream. And I'm not saying those things are not important, but I think they're overvalued in the sense that we come to believe that they can be the end all be all, that they can make change. And I really think that's not true. That there has to be what I call in that earlier book, a period of incubation, an opportunity to actually refine ideas, to recruit people to your ideas, to even have some privacy, some like space among trusted people to egg one another on towards more ambition and more creativity and imagination and the kind of ideas that you're trying to present, in finding ways to meet the needs of reality with your ideals, finding that kind of compromise, like that. You cannot do that on like Twitter. It doesn't work. And I think even in the realm of protest, I think there's something really positive in the No King's Day protests that we've seen in the last, they're not perfect, but they do three things I think that are really good. Is that they're very diffuse, right? It's not just like one day we all meet in one place. It's every community has its thing. The bar to entry is pretty low. Like, you just have to not want authoritarianism, right? But that could be because you're not happy about the foreign policy. That could be because of the immigration policy. That could be because of LGBTQ stuff. It allows people like a very wide door to walk into. And the third thing, which I think is really important, is that it's continuous. It's like we're coming together, and then in 3 months, there's another one. And in 3 months after that, there's another one. It's not like a thing where you feel like, okay, I've shown up and I've done what I had to do. You're in a kind of a small way, you're building up muscle, a kind of an ability to be braver and braver, like every time that you go out. So I think that I think being loud is not as important as sort of being thoughtful and deliberate.
Well, and maybe there's an element of necessary but not sufficient. And that really rhymes with, first of all, a question that came up in the chat from Solus Brea, probably pronouncing that wrong, but my apologies. Why are more people not outraged? Marches every couple of months is a piss poor response, even taking the scale of the U.S. into account. And that's followed up by Jim Williams pointing out the protests in Albania that are going on day and night. And the rejoinder, look, the Women's March did little to protect women, but it seems like Europeans have this in their DNA much more than Americans. I just put in the chat my own article on Substack that got a fair amount of resonance and rattle around Substack, but which basically rhymed with your conclusion that there's some value in the No Kings protests. They're doing something. They're doing something positive. They make me feel better. But again, they do run up against that line between that which makes us feel better and that which accomplishes something. And there's much more that goes into that mix. There's another one of your traits that you outlined that also really walks that fine line. I wanted to ask you about. You talk about the value of, or the trait of, humor, political humor in chapter 3. And it really raises an issue for me in that you talk about Diogenes, for example, famous for wandering, looking for an honest man with a lantern, but also for being an ascetic. And you talk about the incident where he was on the slave auction block, about to be sold into slavery. And he had some really good quips that you write about. But you also point out that he was subsequently sold as a slave. And so it raises this question of what is humor for when it comes to dissent? Diogenes was dissenting. We have plenty of political satirists who are doing phenomenal work puncturing Trump. You show just how fragile authoritarians feel about political satire and as that form of dissent. But ultimately, it never seems to actually accomplish anything in terms of ending authoritarianism or diminishing its impact. So what is it for? Is humor as a form of dissent useful for accomplishing something, or is it a coping mechanism?
I think it's both. I think that it can be incredibly just soothing to you to be able to laugh at a reality that feels impossible to get out of, right? And I talk about Alexei Navalny in the book a lot, the Russian dissident. And when you read his memoir, it's really, really funny. He's sitting in prison. The guy knows he's probably going to die. And he's just the black humor that he produces. He's on a hunger strike and he writes, "Oh, and I still don't have a six-pack." You could see that it makes him feel better to do that. But I don't think that's the only function of it. And I would take issue, I think, with the idea that it's not effective. It might not be effective in the sense that you make a joke that makes the power crumble instantaneously, but it has a kind of a slow chipping effect, which is that what humor does is it inverts the world, right? It says that like all these things that we take for granted, that we think are just natural, I mentioned this sort of before in different contexts, we can throw them up in the air and make fun of them. If you think of a good observational comedian, right, I don't know, I can do my Jerry Seinfeld imitation, but
people use paper clips,
but what's happening in that moment? What's happening in that moment is that the comedian is saying, here's this thing that we think is like, we don't even think about. And let's actually put some distance between us and it. And when we do, it's funny, but we also realize that it doesn't have to be that way. So when you think about that in the context of authoritarians and the way that they want to project their power, they want for you to believe that there is an inevitability about their power, that there is no other way that it could be. This is why Trump loves putting his face all over the place, because there is a kind of it becomes part of the environment, part of the landscape.
Well, it connects to what you write about, I think, if I'm hearing you right, in chapter 4 about the role of asking questions. It's that sort of puncturing of the narrative. And again, it's an area where it really falls on the fault line for me of like, what works? And maybe I'm impatient. Maybe I'm not taking a long enough term view, but you talk about Antonio Gramsci. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing his name too. I'm a prolific mispronouncer of names. Really good.
There's a lot in this book. I read the audiobook and every 5 minutes we had to stop and just make sure.
That must have been a chore. Well, the dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn said of the Soviet Union that in our country, the lie has become not just a moral category, but a pillar of the state. And what you're pointing out is that you've got to puncture that somehow. And this really connects to the conversation going on in the chat, which is about Trump's promised Thursday speech, in which apparently he's going to make some kind of bullshit claim about vote rigging in 2020. And he's apparently going to claim that 2 Democratic US sitting senators are not legitimately in office. And who knows what it's going to kick off. And so I see your point that part of the value of humor and satire is it starts to chip away at that. At the same time, my recent guest, Glenn Kessler, who was the Washington Post fact checker, documented 30,573 false or misleading claims during Trump's first term. And I'm not sure how much that mattered. I'm genuinely not sure. So what is that role, whether it's through humor or fact checking, of truth telling as a dissident in the face of government lies? How valuable is it? How important is it?
Look, I think that you can be in a situation like the one we're in now, or the one that people are living in, people living in the Soviet Union, in a society of total lies, and they still gathered together in these small apartments and decided that they were going to document in a rigorous way, using Western style journalistic ethics and standards, what was happening to them, what was happening to their country, the ways that civil liberties were being shut down, that human rights were being violated. Like, when you think about that, like the faith involved in doing that, in believing that it mattered, even when you're like a little tiny island inside of a society that tells you that it really doesn't matter. I think that what you're seeing there is people doing it because they believe that it's important regardless of the immediate effect that it might have. And I do think it has an immediate effect. While we, using we, assuming that we're coming from the same place, are out of political power, right? In a democracy, like, what you want to do is try to change people's minds, right? And try to get people to think a certain way, or to get people to come to understand certain things about their government. And I think you're not going to see a day-to-day immediate response, but you can also give up. And that humor chapter, the one anecdote I really was that I was looking at the work of this Harvard historian of the French Revolution, a guy named Robert Darnton, who wanted to understand how people built up to the French, to actually cutting off the king's head, right? You want to talk about needing to, how hard it is to make change. Imagine that imagine that the person who's in charge of your country is considered a literal deity, right? So how do you get to the point mentally where you're able to do that, right? Where you're not completely intimidated and you're able to do that, where people can rise up. And the thing that he studied was that there were jokes, bawdy, almost pornographic jokes about the king that circulated in Parisian cafes, like in the 10 years before the French Revolution. And we know about these jokes because they're in the police records of the late 18th century. If you go into the police records in Paris,
That's amazing.
You find that they're like tracking down, they're trying to track down. They're like, Jean-Michel in Café Flore said to Jean-Baptiste that the king, so they're trying to get these networks of joke telling. And it's funny, but it also shows you what a threat it was, right? A threat it was to the regime that they would do that, because they understood at some kind of fundamental level, just the way that Putin understood when he came into power and got rid of a puppet show that was making fun of him, or that Trump was targeting Jimmy Kimmel, of all people. They understood, these authoritarians, that those jokes actually matter because they erode, in probably not as quick way as you would like, Matt, but they do erode slowly and steadily the sense of absolute power and authority that these people try to project.
Right. The kind of Mussolini, the leader is always right.
Yeah.
Leader beans. And look, I think this connects to where I landed, which is maybe you hint at this a little bit in your Kundera Havel debate chapter. I don't know. I'm weighing whether to give you my conclusion before I set up the question, or go about this the other way around. But what people are saying in the chat is they're nervous about this insane thing that apparently, please don't show up at my house, DOJ. Okay. Like, fuck, I don't have all the attorneys that the New York Times has at their disposal. Like, we'll see what the media is going to do. And Solis Brea makes the point, humor will not be enough while people are being gunned down in the streets. It reminds me of,
I think so too. Yeah.
Well, it reminds me of the behavioral economist Daniel Kahneman and his book Thinking Fast and Slow. It
Mhm.
seems like there's a fast and there's a slow to this, and that perhaps you need both. Like perhaps you need the chipping away, and perhaps you need more expedient action. But so let's get to the debate that you set up in, I believe it's chapter 6.
Yeah.
So actually, I won't set it up for you. Maybe you can talk a little bit about this back and forth between these two Czech writers and which side they were each on.
Yeah. So Kundera was a sort of a brilliant, his novels for people who he's gone out of fashion, but I highly recommend his novels, which meant a lot to me, especially as a teenager. It's interesting. But he was able to diagnose and really dramatize and illustrate what totalitarianism did to people and what it does to a society and the way that it gets into people's brains. And so, but he also had an idea that in order to do this kind of work, he couldn't be in Czechoslovakia. He couldn't be fighting
Mm,
the fight. So he basically exiled himself. His work was harder and harder for him to do his work there. And so he exiled himself and he lived in Paris for most of his life. Václav Havel, who was his sort of younger friend, thought that this was a mistake, thought that you had to resist completely with all your body every single day, every single moment, and that even though you might not see the immediate gains. So they had a debate about petitions, signing a petition. So Havel, who was a playwright, actually dramatized this in a play, in a two-man play, where some guy who's like a kind of a Kundera stand-in is asked to sign a petition, and he gives all kinds of reasons, which are not illegitimate reasons. He says, well, if I sign this, then I can't really help from the outside, and what about my family, and all these things, and will it really do any good, or is the government just going to crack down even more? And Havel, who had signed lots of petitions and who also had been in jail, said that he thought this was wrong, that every petition that was signed was a kind of a shot across the bow to the government. And even if it didn't have immediate effects, over time, it did start to change their sensitivity to what they could do with impunity, because they knew that people were watching. One of the chapters in this book is called Be Watchful. And I say in the book that this is the kind of quality that I feels most accessible to me, because it comes not from a place of bravery, but a place of curiosity. I understand it as a journalist. Somebody tells you should not see something or cannot see something, or that something that you think happened didn't happen, or that a piece of history that you know is important and is real doesn't matter or shouldn't exist, or we should forget about and throw in the memory hole. Those are the moments where you perk up and you're like, wait a second, don't tell me I can't see this thing that is true. And that can turn you into a dissident in a lot of situations, because you are insisting on watching, on seeing what is happening.
it may be. I really thought about this back and forth. I really did, because I don't know, I'm a cynic. I'm not a petition signer. I don't feel deep down that kind of thing really matters. And I'm much more in the camp of, as a congressional staffer,
Yeah.
I got really fed up with the performative aspects
Yeah.
of politics
Yeah.
and the protest aspects. I remember during the Iraq War, a group of women posed naked, spelling out the word "no war." Maybe it was Bush, and like they were doing some kind.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's very memorable. I remember that.
Yeah.
But did it do anything?
Yeah.
No. And so that's like congenitally what's in me. And yet you point out that Havel ended up as the prime minister, right? He actually he won the debate in a way.
Yeah, but I will say the petitions that he's talking about mostly are like, they're political prisoners. They're like real people who are being locked up for being in a rock band or whatever. Not like real things that either those people get ignored, or you decide to take a stand and they just rot in prison, or enough people believe that a civil society still exists inside of this place that it is not supposed to exist, and say, no, we're banding together and we're going to sign a petition that says these people shouldn't be release these prisoners. So it had a very concrete, it wasn't performative in that sense. I think what he's talking about, it was about like, how do you actually make it so that things that are supposed to be silenced are not being silenced. So there is a connection to what you're talking about, but I think that It's very sort of concrete. And maybe that is the dividing line. Maybe it's what are the things that we're choosing to be performative about? Can we really make specific and concrete the demands and the complaints so that it's not just no war, but issues about congressional approval for military operations or whatever it is that actually grounds it in an idea that people can get around in a real way.
Yeah, and I think there's again, it did make me reflect, and I thought a lot about the American Civil Rights Movement
Yeah.
and you don't get the Voting Rights Act of 65, the Civil Rights Act of 64 without two American acronyms, without both MLK and
Mhm.
LBJ.
Yeah.
And in almost equal measure, you don't get there without the dissident bravery of the mother of Emmett Till and the people who marched. It's a little trite to talk about Selma, but Selma, right? Like
Yeah. No.
you don't get there without that. But on the other hand, you don't get there without the inside patient maneuvering
Yeah.
of a very complex figure like LBJ. You don't
Yeah.
get the 1957 Civil Rights Act. You don't get the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And
Yeah.
so it's both.
No, and when it works well, it's totally an orchestra. That is the truth of it. It's always true. My first book was about looking at a movement to get Jews out of the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and it was totally an orchestra in the sense that you had real activists doing crazy stuff on the ground that we would call performative today, setting bombs off in New York City at the Bolshoi Ballet to protest the Soviet Union. But then you had these high-level negotiations in the White House, and the two could work off of each other in very interesting ways. And that was true of the civil rights movement. You also had King and you had Malcolm X. You had
Right.
the threat of an even more extreme form of activism. So deal with us, because if you don't deal with us, you're going to be dealing with him or having to pay the consequences of what he's going to do. So I think that it's always a careful balance. In the book, I have an example actually from the civil rights movement. I think it's one of the things that I really was so happy that I included because it got at the complexity of this question you're asking, which was the Children's Crusade in Birmingham, Alabama. Was this attempt to desegregate Birmingham in 1963 was one of the most segregated cities in kind of a brutal form of segregation. They had a sheriff named Bull Connor, and they couldn't really break through. And at some point, they made a decision, or some of the younger people in the civil rights movement suggested, let's send the kids to the front line, right? And we know that this was successful. We know the images with the dogs and the fire hoses. And so we can look back at it now, and they managed to desegregate the city. This was a successful campaign. But I decided to rewind to that moment to use children, which is some of these kids were like 6 years old. It was a really reckless thing to do at one level. But King was forced into a corner in a way because he had been in jail in Birmingham. And in his letter from a Birmingham jail, he made the argument that what you needed to do was create these moments of tension, create these moments that really illustrated the evils of segregation so that he could use that to get done what he wanted to get done. He could use the effect that it would have mostly on northern whites to actually change laws. And so against the wishes of a lot of the parents of these kids, he decided that it was a risk worth taking, and it paid off. But it was outwardly directed in the sense that it was focused on a particular objective. It was trying to change the laws in Birmingham, Alabama. It wasn't just let me do this thing that could potentially be self-destructive or destructive for the sake of being pure or something. It was, I'm going to do this because it might be the thing that sort of helps us break through and get something done in this city.
It reminds me of the movie The Untouchables, where the Sean Connery character asks Elliot Ness, what are you prepared to do? And that's really the question that comes up over and over again. And in one case, it's, do we put our children out front because the moral question of what Bull Connor would be willing to do to children is so clear.
Yeah.
That's the effective thing. For Nelson Mandela, people forget he's a world hero, deservedly so, one of my personal heroes. Let's not forget that part of his activism did involve bombings and violence.
Yeah.
And that was how far he went. And actually, it reminds me of a very quick story. And then I know we have to wrap in a minute, but I had an opportunity when I was in grad school. There was a brown bag lunch being being organized with someone whose name I didn't recognize, named Ahmed Kathrada. And I decided on a whim to go. And I sat down, and as it turns out, I was sitting next to him, next to the speaker. Well, it turned out he was one of the 6 men incarcerated on Robben Island with Mandela for 27 years. And I asked him about it. I asked him about what Mandela did to keep them together, to keep them united in their dissent during that long period in prison. And he told a story about a time the guards tried to essentially suborn Mandela, to try to separate him from his fellow prisoners, to give him privileges. And he talked about Kathrada, a time where they all had dysentery. They were all sick. They're throwing up and they have diarrhea. And he had drawn the duty, Mandela, to have the mop and bucket and clean up. And he refused the offer to forgo it. And he's there with a mop and bucket cleaning up. And that's his act of dissent. And was it meaningful? Well, I would say that it was, because it's a very small act.
But it showed them his
right. And it resonated, and it kept this group of dissenters together. And ultimately, anyway, I want to get to the ultimate conclusion here. This is where I need you to solve all my moral dilemmas. I'm going to quote you from your epilogue.
Okay.
You wrote, "When masked agents carried out an aggressive and violent campaign of deportation in American cities, grabbing anyone who looked like they might be undocumented, even killing those who got in their way, I had to ask myself, how should I respond? I knew that activists had gone to the courthouse to help protect people from being nabbed after leaving their asylum hearings. Should I join them? Even some elected officials had been detained for doing as much. Should I risk it myself? Should I send my children?" Another crisis. In 2023, militants perpetrated a horrific massacre in Israel, the country where my parents were born, and Israel responded with appalling disproportion, with an unrelenting, gruesome war that took little care for the lives of civilians. It leveled Gaza, killed tens of thousands of innocent Palestinians, 20,000 children. I dreaded the daily scroll through the war crimes. It tore me apart, since Israel is a country whose people and future I care about, but whose government is violating so many of the values that matter to me. How should I respond? By disavowing my family, including my young cousin who's a soldier, by joining a protest, even if it means standing next to someone calling for an end to Israel itself. And the reason I wanted to quote that is that, first of all, it very personally connected to a lot of the same dilemmas that I'm feeling. And I strongly suspect connects to the same dilemma that we started at the top with, and that a lot of people who are listening and watching are feeling themselves. How far should you go? What did you conclude after doing this entire book? How far should you go? What are you prepared to do? What's the guidance that you drew from all of this for the rest of us?
Well, I'm afraid it's going to be an unsatisfying answer.
Damn it. I'm here. You're supposed to be my therapist, man. Come on. I need this.
No, the conclusion that I drew is that I can't turn away. I think that and I don't think I'm alone in this. I'm willing to, I think I can safely say this, that I think most of us spend our days not wanting to actually confront that notion that we have moral agency, that we can do something. In each of these instances that you described, I did do something. I did the thing that I felt that I could do. Is it the maximum thing? When I talked about Israel, I was like, oh, if I really wanted to do, I should go there. I should go there and move there and be part of the forces that are trying to move that country in a direction that is the direction that I want it to go to. That would be the thing to do. Can I do that right now? Not really. I have my family here, I have my job here, I have other things. But I think, and this is why maybe it's unsatisfying, because it's not do X, Y, Z. It's have a mindset, right? Have a mindset that actually considers for yourself what would be meaningful and what you could actually look back on. And I've done this exercise a lot. Like when I look back on my life, what will be the decisions that I make at those moments of crossroads that I'll say, oh, that's what gave my life meaning, is that I did that hard thing, and that I did the hard thing that allowed me to feel more at peace with myself, and that I was aligned with where my conscience is. So the lesson for me from this book was not a specific action, although it has changed the way I think, the way I read a newspaper in the morning and see a picture of a dead child, and it forces me not to just turn the page, but actually think, what's going on here? I need to learn more. I need to involve myself in the ways that I can. Sometimes it means that the choice I'm making is that I can't do anything right now about this, but it's a choice, is what I mean to say. It's not just a passive acceptance that things happen in the world and I'm just a pawn and I can't actually contribute in any way. It's an understanding that I have choice. And on top of that, just to close it off, that seems like a burden, right? It seems like a terrible responsibility, but I came around to the idea that it's also a gift. It's also this ability that we have as human beings to actually have moral choice and make decisions about our life is an incredible thing when you think about it. But I quote Sartre in the book talking about how making these moral choices is like creating a work of art. And so if you think about your life as this kind of self-portrait that you're painting, and every one of these choices is like a brushstroke, it actually turns it from something that feels burdensome to something that provides, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity at every one of those crossroads to do the thing that actually makes you feel like you're having a meaningful life.
And I think on that note, it really does connect to the comments that we're closing out with, where people are acknowledging that this is the Israel and Gaza war has brought up a deeply morally troubling issue and a very divisive one, not just for people on the left. People are talking about how they're struggling with it. And I think what I took from your list in your epilogue of questions, which, like I said, rhymes with the same kinds of questions I'm asking myself, where I tell my son, hey, no, you've asked me for the 15th time, can we go to Chick-fil-A? And I'm going to say no, because I don't like their stand on gay people. On the other hand, if I draw the line there, why not at the other 15 billion horrible corporations that do terrible things? I don't know the answer. And I think what it leaves me with is I'm not sure that I know the answer, and I'm not sure that I can judge other people's answers. So I think what I'm taking away from your book and looking at all these different traits that dissidents have had is people are really struggling with these kinds of questions. And maybe I should be a little less judgmental and give people a little bit more grace
Yeah,
about the way they're trying to navigate them, as long as they're doing it in good conscience and good faith,
yeah,
because goodness knows I struggle with it myself. Well,
yeah.
so the book is, and I'm just going to put it right back up on the screen, How to Be a Dissident. And it is the latest in a series of really fascinating books from you that I enjoyed this. I got a lot out of it, and I recommend it very highly to people. So thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Matt. I really enjoyed the conversation.
And for everyone out there, I just a programming note that I'm taking a week off next week from the struggle because it's exhausting. I'm going with my family to the beach, which I don't enjoy. I actually don't like the beach. But now, after we're talking about all these dissidents and people who suffered, I don't want to be a spoiled brat about it either. So I'm going to try to enjoy it. I have not yet quite figured out who's going to cover. Maybe Cliff will come in and cover this live stream next week. Maybe we'll have a guest host. I'm not quite sure yet. But in the meantime, this conversation has underscored just how difficult all of this is. We have difficult days ahead in the next 48 hours. We're going to be confronted with another act of corruption and authoritarian reach from our president. It's a lot to deal with. So wherever you are, stay safe, be well, hang in there together. And I will see you, if not next week, in 2 weeks. Take care.